Welcome to More Than Words, a podcast about treating the whole child, brought to you by the Reading and Language Learning Center. I'm your host, Tristan, and today I'm joined by licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Lindsey Dogali, to discuss signs and symptoms of dyslexia across the lifespan. Hi, Dr. Dogali. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. We're excited to have you here. So let's start off by having you just introduce yourself, tell us about who you are, what you do, all that kind of stuff.
Sure. So yes, I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I have my own private practice now where I exclusively focus on testing. So I provide full range of testing services from, targeted ADHD testing to psychoeducational testing, which really focuses more on cognitive and learning differences more for school purposes.
Right.
And then I also provide more comprehensive neuropsychological evaluations where we're really, diving deep into everything, intelligence, attention, memory, learning, how one is just processing information, as well as the social and emotional factors at play. So diagnostically, I see a lot of dyslexia and other learning disabilities, ADHD, autism, anxiety. I would say those are sort of the bulk of what I see and what I specialize in.
Very cool. And remind me, where is your practice like in the world?
Yes. So my it's in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and not yet serving Virginia and DC, although I do, of course, it's all very close. So I do. I see a lot of clients that live there, but I do not have offices there.
Right.
But yes, I work with clients kind of all over the DMV.
Awesome. Okay. And so if people were trying to find you online, where would they go?
Yep. So my website, do you want me to kind of spell it? I feel like when I say it, it gets, so it's psych testing, the number 4 kids.com.
Okay, perfect. I'll add that in the show notes and then people can click.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be great.
Fabulous. Alrighty. Well, let's just hop into everything. And you know that we do dyslexia here at the Reading and Language Learning Center, but it's always good to start off with basis. So what's dyslexia?
Yes. So in the most simplest terms, it is a specific learning disability that primarily impacts reading. Right. But there are many secondary impacts that we'll talk about today. But, from a neurological perspective, dyslexia is, there are brain-based differences basically in how the brain is wired differently to sort of process language information. So what that means is sort of non-dyslexic learners, they learn to read by first learning kind of how the speech sounds of our language make up words, right? So that's phonological awareness. And then, as they get a little bit older, they learn to connect sounds with letters, which is the phonics. And then, of course, later on, they're learning to blend those sounds into words. And then eventually, with enough exposures to that same word and process, it forms sort of that automatic recognition or a sight word.
Right.
So for dyslexic learners, they, fundamentally have more trouble with phonological awareness and phonics. And so that difficulty is sort of reflecting the differences in how their brain is wired. So there's underactivation in the parts of the brain that we use for reading. So without getting super nerdy on the terms of the brain,
right.
Basically it just means that it's not that dyslexics will not learn to read ever without intervention. It's just that it's almost like the brain is like taking a detour to access that information. And so it's taking longer, it's more effortful to really develop the automaticity that we need to be fluent readers.
Right.
So I always like to think of it from sort of like a brain, what's happening in our brains, really.
Yeah, that's a really good definition. I think it's hard for people to conceptualize dyslexia because they're just like, oh, well, you like reverse your letters or whatever, right? Yes. But that is a really I think, easy to digest way, and it makes a lot more sense when you like break it out like that. So thank you for that description.
Yeah. And it also, I think, helps to understand why dyslexia can look so different for each person. And as we'll talk about later, how it shows up throughout the lifespan. But for some kids, it might not really even show up until later on, right? It also depends on the severity. But there are a lot of sort of myths out there about dyslexia. And so I think a lot of teachers even don't really know what a lot of these signs and symptoms are. So yeah, I'm excited to talk more about that.
Yeah. And we didn't get into like, not the origin story, but like how dyslexia kind of comes down the line. So is it hereditary?
Yes. So that's actually one of sort of the best, I don't want to say red flags, but sort of markers. So asking about family history is always my number one question. If a parent has it, I think a child has up to a 50% chance of having it as well. And so in my household, I'll say my husband is dyslexic. And so from day one, I've been very closely monitoring and honestly even getting started on early intervention before the signs even showed up, because why not, right?
Yeah. And then another myth I think that is around is there a cure for dyslexia?
Right. So no, it's a lifelong condition. And honestly, in some ways, I think that's a really great thing because, dyslexia, there is a model of like dyslexia as like, the sea of strengths model, meaning, because people with dyslexia do sort of process and look at the world differently, that comes with a lot of very unique qualities and strengths. So in a way, we don't want to like wish away all of those wonderful things. But there are interventions, obviously remediation and accommodations that absolutely will help kids overcome the reading challenges. Some things may always, persist and be a little bit harder, which we'll talk about. But the strengths definitely persist, and that's also incredible.
Yeah. So you mentioned the like red flags or other signs. What are those in like early childhood?
Yes. So, again, not every person is going to present with each and every one of those these signs, but really the first signs in some, again, not everyone, emerge before we even ever ask or expect kids to be reading, because again, dyslexia is language based. So some of the earliest signs can even emerge just with oral speaking. So some, not all, some dyslexics are later to talk. Some will have sort of oral like mispronunciations of words beyond the point that we would expect kids maybe kindergarten to start kind of outgrowing some of those cute things like Paschetti for spaghetti, or aminal for animal. Multi-syllable words, the sequence of sounds can be confused. And then another kind of oral sign is rhyming. Because again, that's a precursor to understanding the sounds and words. And so by probably kindergarten age, we're expecting, kids to be able to understand and produce rhymes. So having difficulty with rhyming is a key sign. But then, getting into kindergarten, first grade, some key signs here is just, not recognizing or being able to name letters and letter sounds, and writing letters as well, because dyslexia has its roots in, again, the sequencing. One sign that people may not know about necessarily is like difficulty sequencing days of the week or months of the year, sort of like list learning. A lot of kids with dyslexia also have working memory issues. So sequencing of steps, in a morning routine, remembering that sequence, those are just some signs that don't necessarily have to do with reading, but can certainly be there. but more specific to reading, just, difficulty decoding in the early years, decoding, simple words like cat,
Right.
dad, and then difficulty retaining sight words. So learning and retaining. So a lot of times I'll hear parents say, we're reading together on one page and she knows that word was cat, or I told her it was cat. And then she sees it on the next page and it's like she's never seen the word before.
Yeah.
So that difficulty with retention of new sight words. And then, as kids are reading, a little bit more fluently, you're going to see a lot of oral reading errors.
Yeah.
And so some common errors here include a lot of guessing. So, if they see the word special, for instance, and they're like, okay, I recognize that SP and I know what that sound is, but the rest of the other internal details of the word, are not really clicking. And so you'll have kids will guess, right? So they might say space instead. Letter sequences can be flipped. So like left and felt, or cloud and could, so all of those letters are there, but they're sort of jumbled. And again, that's not a vision issue, right? They're seeing 2020, but it's like access to what that stored, word is in the brain. Another oral reading error that happens actually a lot is over-reliant on context cues. And so the kid, especially if there's pictures, right? They're reading a sentence and they see the picture, even if there's not pictures, but they get the gist of the rest of the sentence, but the one word, they might just, let's say it's, I saw a horse, or I saw a pony, and there's a picture of a horse. They would say, I saw a horse, because they're looking at the picture. That's a sign that they're not actually reading, but they're focused on the context and sort of memorization. And a little bit older kids, I almost always see this, which is confusing the small words when they're reading.
Oh.
The, that, a, and, is, she, he. These either get substituted for each other or just get completely skipped or inserted. Same with like word endings like the ed and s. So, there's a lot of theories. I've read a lot of reports where that's sort of assumed to be an ADHD inattentive reading error. And maybe that is true for some, but I see this so often in dyslexia. My theory is when you're focused so much on decoding some of the bigger words, the words that carry meaning for the sentence, there's just not enough cognitive resources available to really pay attention to the smaller words.
Right.
So let's see, obviously spelling is also implicated in dyslexia.
Yeah.
And so usually kids are beyond the age that this is typical, continuing to spell phonetically. And so, about 50% of the words in the English language are not spelled with that perfect one-to-one correspondence.
Right.
But kids with dyslexia are just not picking up, they're not going to pick up on this stuff with just mere exposure. They really need the explicit instruction and taught the rules.
Right.
So a couple more in the early years, you might also see some symbol confusion in math. So, mixing up pluses and minuses.
Right.
And then just on the like social emotional side, you're going to see avoidance of reading. You're going to see frustration, anxiety. And another thing is that young kids don't really have the words or just even understand what's happening when they're trying to read.
Right.
And so many will tell their parents or teachers that, reading causes them headaches, or the words are jumping around or moving on the page. And of course, I think that sounds, alarm bells for vision. And so a lot of parents, go and get a vision assessment. And that's not to say that there, in some cases there are comorbid vision issues, like convergence insufficiency, in which case vision therapy may be helpful, but it's still not going to cure dyslexia, because dyslexia is not a vision problem. So if you're hearing a child, complain about either headaches or just something is not, words are jumbled or moving, Certainly you can rule out the vision, but I would also be thinking about dyslexia in that case.
Yeah. Wow. Those are really interesting
What?
signs. Yeah. But it's also like, one thing I want to know is that you never said they'll confuse B and D. They'll confuse P and Q. You know what I mean? Because those are such, every time someone like thinks of what dyslexia is, that's like the only thing they can really say.
Right.
And it's so many other things like you just said, and especially with stuff where they're not even reading yet. I think those are really good signs to look out for, that are so much easier to identify than like focusing so hard on like, oh, are you reading this correctly or stuff like that.
And the B's and D's, P's and Q's that can be confused.
Right.
And I think it goes both sides. I think some teachers say that's very normative, which it is, but maybe they think it's normative beyond when it really is, but it's all a spectrum. So it is normative, but to what degree is the child struggling to make those mental representations of the letter and the way that the letter looks? So that can be a sign, but yes, it's not
the only
sign for sure.
Yeah. So I appreciate all the other things that you shared. So we talked about like earlier on, and I think we got up to like maybe early elementary, like mid early elementary years. So let's look at everywhere, if you don't mind. How does dyslexia impact a person at like toddler, preschool, kindergarten, and then keep going?
Right. So I feel like we probably covered the earlier years, but sort of maybe starting later elementary or middle, you're going to see in terms of reading, all of the things I mentioned before can persist, but you're going to see more probably with reading, slower reading, just, slower, more avoidance, probably more anxiety about reading aloud. And then really struggling to decode and learn new vocabulary or especially new academic, words that are multi-syllable that they've never seen before, because, they don't have those word attack skills to really break it down. And so, because again, kids will learn to read, right? It's just not going to be as fluent. And again, there's going to be more errors when they come across unfamiliar words. And then you may, on the writing side, the spelling errors and the grammar errors will absolutely begin to be a bigger problem. And probably note-taking is another one. I see a lot of kids that struggle to keep up with the note-taking in class, and then getting, ideas onto paper in an organized fashion. Now, we're kind of crossing over into dysgraphia a little bit, but they're, closely tied together there. And then, foreign language is another big one. So kids are sometimes exposed to it very early on in elementary or middle school, but oftentimes in those early years, there's more focus on just like speaking the language. But as we get into like reading and writing the language, they're really often going to struggle. Some do better with Spanish because it tends to be a little bit more phonetic. But some even struggle, to learn Spanish. There's some research out there that says Chinese or Japanese may be easier to learn because, it's the symbols are easier and they're more visual in nature, more like pictorial rather than language based. But certainly, you're going to see signs more as you get older on spelling and writing, I think, too. And that really gives you an indication of the command of the English language. But then, in adulthood, so, if I'm seeing people, maybe I've diagnosed a child and the parent is like, wow, like, I feel like, you're asking me so many questions. It feels like my experience as a child, or these are things I still struggle with. In adulthood, I think the fluency, so just continuing to be slower, continuing to be, not enjoy reading for pleasure, or have a preference for audiobooks, is a big one. Continuing to be a poor speller, I think I said. So, my husband is dyslexic, very bright and successful, but I have to sort of edit his emails and,
Right.
his writing, because that spelling and grammar is just, does not come easily even still.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
And do you have experience with like students that go off to college and like maybe they've known they've had dyslexia for a while, or maybe they're just now finding out, but like, what does that end up looking like? Do they come to you and they say like, oh no, what do they say, I guess?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, if you've gotten that far in life
Mhm.
without a diagnosis or just identification at all, they've developed compensatory strategies.
Right.
And so it may not even be on the radar. Oftentimes they're coming to me for ADHD. And I'm like,
Right.
well, let's do the full thing, make sure we don't miss anything. And it's like, wow, like you really have dyslexia.
Yeah.
And it's usually a validating moment, because it's like, wow, I've always noticed, or I've always known that there's this disconnect. It was always, harder for me to keep up. Like I was always a
Right.
slower reader, or like I always ran out of time on tests. Or, I'm a terrible speller. And I always just thought it was because I didn't pay attention to spelling, or, because I
Right.
was ADHD, or that, so there's a lot of like compensatory strategies that are developed over the years. But the signs are there.
Mhm.
And I think it's usually a really validating experience to know, like, there's a name, there's a label, there's a reason.
Right.
And how amazing are you that, you've compensated so well.
Right. Wow. Very interesting. And leading into the next thing I was going to ask you, like, you finally notice in college or however old you are that you're having this issue. And so is it that it's getting worse with age, or is it just that you've just started to notice it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't think dyslexia gets worse with age, again, because humans do adapt. And so, we learn strategies that will work
Right.
for us. But the achievement gap absolutely widens with time,
Right.
and so often if you're didn't get a diagnosis, I would imagine there's some underachievement that's
Right.
happening. Or something I didn't mention, actually, yeah, which is really important, is dyslexics actually take sometimes like 2 to 3 times longer than their peers
Oh,
to
wow.
get through homework, right? Not
Right.
all dyslexics, because again, there's a wide variance here, and processing speed plays a role. And if you have very fast processing speed, that's another compensatory strategy that's going to work to your advantage.
Right.
But average or slower processing speed and dyslexia, it's going to take a long time to get through homework. And so
Right.
that's another sign that I've seen, is that it's like, wow, it's taking my child like 5 hours to do their homework at night. I don't know what's going on. Maybe they're not focused. So the achievement gap will widen with time. Our brains are most plastic early on. So
Right.
that means that, early intervention is very, very helpful early on. We actually want to see it between ages like 4 and 7, if
Oh, wow.
possible.
Yeah.
But that rarely happens
Right.
because, usually when, it's usually like third grade, I would say, is
Yeah.
third or fourth grade is really when
Mhm.
these things, you're having that shift from learning to read. Now you're reading to learn. And that's the time when really, kids are struggling across the board
Right.
academically. But without this early intervention, yeah, the gap will widen with time. So it's not that dyslexia is getting worse. It's just that um, there's more demands
Right.
as we go on in school. And so, it depends on the individual's kind of unique profile of strengths
Right.
and weaknesses. If there's enough if there's sheer intelligence and effort and a lot of other great strengths, memory, whatever, then they're probably going to get by for longer
Right.
without really needing help. But all people hit a wall at some point
Right.
where the strategies they developed are no longer enough to really either get by or help
Mhm.
them reach their potential, right? There's usually that disconnect between what they're capable of and where they're actually performing.
Yeah. And that sounds like it can be frustrating. So what's the psychosocial impact on dyslexia if it's left like untreated?
Right. Oh, yeah. So, I mean, there's a big impact. Again, it's going to differ depending on the person, but even in the early years, I mean, with reading and writing, that's such a core part of early education, the focus of early education. And so I would say dyslexics experience a huge hit to their self-esteem very early on. They often feel dumb or feel inadequate or inferior to their peers. And they construct, stories about what's wrong with them. And, being stupid or dumb couldn't be further, from the truth.
Right.
But they'll feel that disconnect, right? That, they might not be able to talk about the Harry Potter series that all their friends are reading because they're not really able to read the text yet. And again, audiobooks is a huge help here, but there's a lot of anxiety and inadequacy that can happen with a delayed diagnosis.
Yeah. Since we are we're trying to figure out how to better that situation and across the board for dyslexics, how do they learn best so that they can then, have more confidence in all of those things?
Yes. So I think in general, people with dyslexia are very creative learners. Unfortunately, traditional school tends to be a little bit more focused on sort of rote facts and regurgitation and teach to the test. And many dyslexics just find that boring.
Right.
That's a shared quality with ADHD, but it's like stifling to their creativity. And, so they really do learn best, one, through just multi-sensory instruction. So, visuals, hands-on materials, discussion-based instruction is great too, to really help them utilize their communication skills, because usually they are great, like oral communicators. Helps them develop critical thinking skills, which is another strength, teaching and helping them connect concepts through meaning and like relevance to their lives rather than just, rote facts.
Right.
I think is good. And just allowing for more processing time, and not necessarily because of slow processing, but because many dyslexics do have sort of a retrieval, right, deficit. So, in part of working memory could be part of sort of that rapid automatic naming deficit, where it takes kind of a little bit longer to access information stored in their memory.
Right.
And so, there is a lot of stored knowledge there. These kids are really bright, really intelligent, but they may need a little bit more time to sort of organize and access the things that they know. Right.
And we mentioned this earlier, but how important is early intervention?
Yes. So, it's very important. Evidence-based early intervention can sort of reorganize, rewire the brain, so that children do develop the areas of the brain that are critical for reading fluency. So it's critical, but it's never too late either.
Okay.
So even older adults can, benefit from intervention. So it's never too late, but, earlier will just make the remediation process move a little bit faster.
Right. And what's the first step if someone thinks their child might have dyslexia?
I would say, you do not have to wait for your child to fail or even just fall behind their peers to get an evaluation. So if there are parents listening, I would say, trust your gut. If you feel like, if you're noticing several of these signs I've mentioned, or if you just feel like there's a disconnect, like I know my child works hard and is bright, and they're just not performing up to what I know they're capable of.
Right.
Or why are we seeing tears every time we sit down to read a book when they love listening to stories, or, any of these signs. You don't have to wait until third, fourth, fifth grade. You can get an evaluation earlier and at least identify kind of strengths and potential red flags, even if it's too early for a definitive diagnosis, because that information can then, be utilized for intervention and for accommodations in school.
Yeah.
So I would say, find an evaluator that understands dyslexia,
right,
because it can present differently. It can be, nuanced. And, a private evaluation absolutely is more costly than going through school, but it really is this, investment in your child's future, a roadmap to help them be as successful as possible.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Do you have I think that was my last question for you, but do you have anything else you want to add?
I feel like that was really, I hope that was thorough.
Oh, yeah.
I talked a lot. No, but if you wanted to put my email out too, so if there are any questions that parents or whoever's listening have for me, then I'd be happy to
that'd be great.
Respond via email. Yeah.
Perfect. I'll add that to the show notes as well.
Okay, sure.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much to the audience for listening. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a little rating and review. It helps other folks find the podcast, and we'll chat with you next time.